The flash hadn't even gone off yet, when my wife's voice cut through the studio like a blade through silk. "Can you step out? Your face is making everyone feel uncomfortable and ruining our beautiful picture." I stood there, frozen between the Victorian backdrop and my family, watching 37 years of marriage crumble in front of a roomful of strangers. The photographer's assistant stopped adjusting the lights. The other families waiting their turn suddenly found their phones fascinating. Even Mrs. Henderson from down the street, who'd been chatting about her garden, went silent. "My name is Jim Sullivan. I'm 43, a boat mechanic at Sullivan's Marina, the business my father built and left to me. I fix engines, repair hulls, and apparently I ruin family photos just by existing." "Margaret," I said quietly, using my wife's full name like I did when I was trying to keep my temper in check. "What are you talking about?" She didn't even look at me, just kept primping our 18-year-old daughter Katie's hair while her two friends, Linda and Susan, flanked her like bodyguards in their matching cardigans. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Margaret said, her voice carrying that HR manager tone she used at the tech firm downtown. "This is for my birthday celebration. I want it to be perfect." The photographer, old Pete Kowalski, who'd been taking family portraits in this town for 30 years, cleared his throat. "Maybe we could just—" "No," Margaret cut him off. "Jim can wait outside. We'll do a beautiful photo of 3 generations of women, much more elegant." Katie, bless her heart, tried to stand up for me. "Mom, that's not fair. Dad should be in the picture." "Sit down, Catherine. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." I felt the heat rising in my chest, that familiar burn I'd been swallowing for months now. Margaret's friends were smirking behind their hands. Linda actually had her phone out, probably texting the whole story to her book club before I'd even left the room. But I didn't make a scene, didn't throw the tantrum they were all expecting. Instead, I did what I'd been doing for the past 6 months. I kept my mouth shut and walked away. "Take your time," I said, grabbing my jacket from the chair. "I'll be at the Harpoon when you're done playing dress-up." The door chimed behind me as I stepped onto Main Street. Through the window I could see them all relaxing, Margaret's shoulders dropping as she arranged herself in the center of the shot, like I was some kind of storm cloud that had finally blown over. That's when I knew for certain what I'd been suspecting for weeks. My wife wasn't just embarrassed by me, she was done with me. And judging by how comfortable she looked orchestrating my public humiliation, she'd been planning this for a while. The Harpoon Tavern sat 3 blocks down from the photo studio, wedged between Murphy's Hardware and the old bait shop that had been closed since the recession. It was the kind of place where the regulars had assigned stools and everyone knew your drink before you ordered it. Dark wood, dim lights, and the smell of fried clams that had soaked into the walls over decades. I pushed through the heavy door and nodded to Frank behind the bar. He was already reaching for a bottle of Budweiser before I'd even sat down. "Little early for you, Jim," he said, popping the cap. "Everything all right?" "Family photo session," I said, taking a long pull from the bottle. "You know how it is." Frank grunted in sympathy. He'd been divorced twice and understood the particular torture of forced family activities. The bar was mostly empty at 2 in the afternoon, just me, Frank, and old Eddie Morrison reading his paper in the corner booth. The kind of peaceful quiet I hadn't felt at home in months. I was halfway through my second beer when my phone buzzed. A text from Katie. "Dad, I'm sorry about Mom. That was awful. Coming to find you when we're done." At least one person in my family still had some decency left. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Margaret. "Taking the girls to lunch at Rossetti's. Don't wait up." Don't wait up? It was barely 3 in the afternoon. But then again, Margaret had been finding excuses to stay out late more and more often. Working late at the office, book club meetings that ran until midnight, yoga classes that somehow required her to change into designer workout clothes I'd never seen her sweat in. I was starting to piece together a picture I didn't like. "Frank," I said, You ever have that feeling like everyone knows something you don't? He looked up from wiping down glasses. Every day of my marriage to Rita. Turned out she was seeing her tennis instructor for 8 months before I figured it out. How'd you find out? Caught them in my own bed. Frank's laugh was bitter. She said it was my fault for coming home early from work. I thought about Margaret's recent behavior. The locked phone, the new clothes, the way she'd been picking fights over everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I breathed too loud while watching TV. What did you do? Frank shrugged. Divorced her. Took half of everything, including the house she thought she was so smart redecorating for her boyfriend. I finished my beer and stood up. Thanks, Frank. I think I need to go home and do some thinking. You need anything, Jim. You know where to find me. The drive back to our house on Elm Street gave me time to let my anger simmer down to something more useful. Margaret had humiliated me in public, but losing my temper wouldn't solve anything. I needed to be smart about this. Our house was a restored colonial that Margaret had insisted on buying 5 years ago. Something that reflects our status in the community, she'd said. I'd preferred the smaller cape closer to the marina, but Margaret always got her way when it came to appearances. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house that was supposed to represent our success. Margaret's BMW wasn't there, which meant she was still at lunch with her friends, probably rehashing my humiliation over expensive wine and Caesar salads. Inside, the house felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through strangers' eyes, the living room that Margaret had decorated in shades of beige and cream. The dining room we never used except when her mother visited. The kitchen with granite countertops that cost more than most people's cars. It was a beautiful house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. I went upstairs to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 15 years. When was the last time we'd been intimate? Really intimate, not just going through the motions? I couldn't remember. That's when I noticed Margaret's coat draped over the chair by her vanity. She'd been in such a hurry to leave for the photo session that she'd forgotten to move it to the closet. I wasn't planning to snoop, but when I picked up the coat to hang it up, a receipt fell out of the pocket. Rossetti's restaurant. Last Tuesday night. Dinner for 2, wine, dessert. The total was over $150. Last Tuesday, Margaret had told me she was working late on quarterly reports. I stood there holding the receipt, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This was it. The proof I'd been afraid to look for. My wife was having an affair. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in my workshop behind the house, staring at that receipt and trying to figure out what to do next. The smart thing would be to confront Margaret directly, ask her to explain the dinner, give her a chance to come clean. But something told me there was more to this story. And after the way she'd humiliated me at the photo studio, I wasn't feeling particularly generous. Margaret came home around 6, breezing through the kitchen like nothing had happened. She was humming some song I didn't recognize, which was unusual. Margaret wasn't typically the humming type. How was lunch? I asked, looking up from the newspaper I'd been pretending to read. Oh, you know Linda and Susan, always gossiping about something. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of white wine. I'm going to take a bath. There's leftover casserole if you want dinner. Leftover casserole. After 15 years of marriage, I rated leftover casserole. Margaret, I said carefully, about today at the photo studio. I don't want to discuss it, Jim. I've had a lovely afternoon and I'd like to keep it that way. She disappeared upstairs with her wine, and 20 minutes later I heard the bathroom door lock. Then the sound of her phone ringing, followed by her voice, muffled but animated. She was talking to someone, and from her tone, it wasn't Linda or Susan. I waited until I heard the bath water running, then quietly climbed the stairs. The bathroom door was closed, but I could hear Margaret's voice through the wood. Can't wait much longer. He's getting suspicious. No, he doesn't know anything for sure. Tuesday was perfect, but we need to be more careful. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure she could hear it through the door. I crept back downstairs and out to my workshop, where I could think without Margaret watching my every move. So it was true. My wife was cheating on me, and apparently they were worried I was catching on. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I could hire a private investigator, gather evidence for a divorce. That was the sensible approach. But after today's public humiliation, sensible wasn't exactly what I was feeling. My phone rang. Katie. Dad, are you okay? You left the studio so fast. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just needed some air. Mom was really mean to you today. I told her so after you left. What did she say? Katie was quiet for a moment. She said you'd understand eventually. That sometimes people grow apart and want different things. Different things. Like $150 dinners with mystery men. Katie, has your mother been acting differently lately? Going out more, maybe? Well, yeah. She's been doing a lot of evening yoga classes, and she joined that new book club that meets on Tuesday nights. Katie paused. Dad, are you and Mom having problems? I didn't want to drag Katie into this mess, but she was 18 years old and smart enough to see what was happening. We're going through a rough patch, honey. But whatever happens, it's not your fault, okay? I know, Dad. I love you. I love you too. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my workshop and made a decision. I wasn't going to be the clueless husband who got blindsided by divorce papers. If Margaret wanted to play games, I was going to learn the rules. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the public library. If Margaret was having an affair, there would be evidence. Phone records, credit card statements, maybe even social media posts. I just needed to know where to look. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, helped me figure out how to search public records online. It turned out there was a lot you could learn about someone if you knew where to look. I started with Margaret's social media accounts. Her Facebook page was mostly work-related posts and pictures of food, but her Instagram told a different story. Recent photos showed her at restaurants I'd never been to, wearing clothes I'd never seen, and in several of the pictures, there was a shadow or reflection that suggested she wasn't alone. Then I found her LinkedIn profile. Margaret worked as an HR manager at TechFlow Solutions, a software company downtown. Her profile listed her connections, and one name caught my attention: David Chen, Senior Sales Manager at TechFlow Solutions. David Chen had his own Instagram account, and it was much more revealing than Margaret's. Pictures of expensive dinners, wine tastings, weekend trips to Boston. And in the background of several photos, I caught glimpses of a woman with Margaret's distinctive auburn hair. I felt sick. My wife wasn't just having an affair. She was having an affair with a coworker, someone she saw every day. Someone who probably knew all about me, about our marriage, about how she really felt about the man she'd promised to love and honor. I printed out everything I could find and drove home with a folder full of evidence. But evidence of what, exactly? That my wife was unhappy? That she'd found someone who could afford better restaurants than I could? None of it was proof of anything illegal. Immoral, maybe. Hurtful, definitely. But not illegal. I needed more. That evening, Margaret announced she had book club again. On a Thursday? I asked. We changed the schedule. Linda's hosting this week. She was already putting on her coat, the same coat I'd found the receipt in. What book are you reading? Margaret paused, her hand on the doorknob. It's a romance novel. You wouldn't be interested. Try me. The Time Traveler's Wife. Very emotional, very complex. I nodded like that made perfect sense. Have fun. After she left, I waited 10 minutes, then got in my truck and followed her. Margaret drove straight downtown, but instead of turning toward Linda's neighborhood, she pulled into the parking lot of the Ocean View Hotel. It was the nicest hotel in town, the kind of place where business travelers stayed when they had expense accounts. I parked across the street and watched as Margaret walked into the lobby. 5 minutes later, a man came out of the hotel and greeted her with a kiss that was definitely not appropriate for book club. David Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of polished look that came from expensive haircuts and tailored suits. He was taller than me, thinner, with perfect teeth that probably cost more than my truck. They disappeared into the hotel together, and I sat in my truck feeling like the world's biggest fool. My wife was cheating on me with a younger, richer, better-looking man, and she was so confident I wouldn't figure it out that she'd humiliated me in public and lied to my face about book club. I drove home and sat in my workshop until Margaret came back at 11:30, humming that same unfamiliar song. But I wasn't the same man who'd been humiliated at the photo studio 2 days ago. That man had been naive, trusting, willing to give his wife the benefit of the doubt. This man was done being a fool. The next morning, I drove to the marina early and found my old friend Tony Ricci working on his lobster boat. Tony and I had grown up together, played high school football together, and been each other's best man. More importantly, Tony had spent 20 years as a state police detective before retiring to run his lobster business. "Jim," Tony said, looking up from the engine he was rebuilding. "You look like hell. What's going on?" I told him everything. The photo studio humiliation, the receipt, the hotel meeting with David Chen. Tony listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or grunting in sympathy. When I finished, Tony wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against his boat. "So what do you want to do about it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront her, but part of me thinks there's more to this story." Tony was quiet for a moment. "You know, Jim, in my experience, when someone's willing to humiliate their spouse in public, it's usually because they're already mentally divorced. They're just working up the courage to make it official." "You think she's planning to leave me?" "I think she's planning something. Question is what?" Tony had a point. Margaret wasn't the type to have a simple affair. She was methodical, organized, always thinking 3 steps ahead. If she was cheating, it was part of a larger plan. "Tell you what," Tony said. "Let me make some calls. I still have friends in the department. We can run a background check on this David Chen guy, see what we're dealing with." "Is that legal?" "Background checks are public record, Jim. We're not talking about wiretapping here." I felt a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Tony. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. We look out for each other, right?" That afternoon, Tony called with information about David Chen. Clean record, no arrests, no outstanding warrants. But there were some interesting details about his employment history. "Guy's been at TechFlow for 2 years, Tony said. Before that, he worked at 3 other companies in 5 years. Always left under mysterious circumstances. No official complaints, but I talked to a buddy who knows someone at his previous job. Word is, Chen has a pattern of getting involved with married co-workers. He's done this before, at least twice that we know of. Both times the women ended up divorced within a year." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You think this is some kind of pattern for him?" "I think your wife might not be as special as she thinks she is." That evening, Margaret announced she was going to yoga class. I waited until she left, then drove to the yoga studio downtown. Margaret's BMW wasn't in the parking lot. I drove to the Ocean View Hotel. There it was, parked next to David Chen's silver Audi. I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to decide what to do. I could storm into the hotel, confront them both, make a scene that would be all over town by morning. But that would just make me look like the jealous, unstable husband Margaret was probably already painting me as. Instead, I took pictures. Margaret's car next to Chen's car. The timestamp on my phone showing it was 8:30 p.m. when Margaret was supposed to be in yoga class. Then I drove home and waited. Margaret came back at 10:15, carrying a yoga mat she'd obviously never used and talking about how relaxing the class had been. "How was the instructor?" I asked. "Oh, she's wonderful. Very spiritual. You should try it sometime, Jim. You seem so tense lately." I wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, I just nodded and went back to watching TV. The next morning, I called Margaret's yoga studio. "Hi, I'm trying to reach my wife, Margaret Sullivan. She's been taking evening classes with you." "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, "but we don't have anyone by that name registered for classes." "Are you sure? She's been going every Thursday for the past month." "I'm positive, sir. We only have 12 people in our evening program, and I know all of them personally." I thanked her and hung up. Margaret had been lying about yoga class, just like she'd lied about book club. I spent the rest of the morning thinking about Tony's information. David Chen had a pattern of targeting married women. But why? Was it just about the thrill of the affair, or was there something more? That afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. I drove to TechFlow Solutions and parked across the street, watching the building. At 5:30, employees started leaving for the day. At 5:45, David Chen walked out of the building and got into his Audi. I followed him. Chen drove to an expensive apartment complex on the other side of town, the kind of place with a doorman and valet parking. He lived well for a sales manager, even at a successful tech company. I was about to leave when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Margaret's BMW pulled into the parking garage. It was Friday evening. Margaret had told me she was going to dinner with her sister in Boston and wouldn't be back until late. Her sister lived 2 hours away, in the opposite direction from Chen's apartment. I sat in my truck, watching the building, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just an affair. Margaret and Chen were living like a couple. She was spending entire evenings at his place, lying to me about where she was going and who she was with. My phone rang. Margaret. "Hi, honey. I just wanted to let you know I made it to Boston safely. Sarah and I are going to have a late dinner, so I probably won't be home until after midnight." "Drive carefully," I said. "I love you." "Love you too." I hung up and stared at Chen's building, where my wife was probably already making herself comfortable in another man's bed. That's when I realized Margaret wasn't just cheating on me. She was practicing for a different life. A life where she lived in an expensive apartment with a younger man who could afford better restaurants and nicer clothes. A life where I didn't exist. Saturday morning, I woke up with a plan. Margaret had come home at 12:30, full of stories about her wonderful evening with her sister. She'd even brought me a t-shirt from a Boston restaurant as proof of where she'd been. It was a nice touch, the kind of detail that showed how much thought she'd put into her deception. "I need to run some errands today," I told her over breakfast. "Mind if I borrow your laptop? Mine's acting up and I want to check my email." Margaret hesitated for just a moment. "Actually, I need it today. I'm working on some reports for Monday." "On Saturday? You know how busy we've been at the office." I nodded like that made perfect sense. But Margaret's reluctance to let me use her laptop told me everything I needed to know. Whatever evidence I was looking for, it was on that computer. "No problem," I said. "I'll use the desktop in the den." Margaret relaxed. "Thanks for understanding." After breakfast, Margaret announced she was going shopping with Linda. She took her laptop bag with her, which confirmed my suspicion that she didn't trust me with it. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake. After 15 years of marriage, I knew all her passwords. Her laptop password was Katie's birthday plus our anniversary year. Her email password was our old address with a number sequence. Margaret wasn't creative when it came to security. I waited until she'd been gone for an hour, then drove to the TechFlow Solutions building. It was Saturday, so the parking lot was mostly empty, but I knew Margaret kept a spare laptop in her office for weekend work. The building had security, but I'd been there before for company parties and knew the layout. I also knew that Margaret's friend Susan worked in accounting and had given me the building access code when I'd surprised Margaret with flowers on her birthday last year. Margaret's office was on the third floor, a corner space that reflected her status in the company. I found the spare laptop in her desk drawer, exactly where I expected it to be. It took me 20 minutes to crack her password and access her email account. What I found there made me sick to my stomach. Months of emails between Margaret and David Chen, not just romantic messages, but detailed discussions about their future together, plans to move in together, discussions about Margaret getting a divorce. And then I found the email that changed everything. It was from Chen to Margaret, dated 3 weeks ago. Once you get rid of Jim, we can sell the marina property and use the money to start fresh somewhere else. My contact at the real estate firm says waterfront property like that is worth at least $2 million. We could buy a house in California, maybe start our own consulting business. You just need to make sure the divorce settlement gives you half of everything. I read the email 3 times, feeling my anger build with each pass. This wasn't just about an affair. Margaret and Chen were planning to steal my family's business, the marina my father had built from nothing and left to me. I kept reading. There were emails about Margaret documenting my emotional instability to use in divorce proceedings. Messages about Chen's lawyer friend who specialized in complex asset division. Plans to paint me as an unfit husband who couldn't provide the lifestyle Margaret deserved. They'd been planning this for months. The public humiliation at the photo studio wasn't random cruelty. It was part of a strategy to build a case against me. I printed out everything and put the laptop back exactly where I'd found it. Then I drove home and called Tony. "We need to meet," I said. "I found something." An hour later, Tony and I sat in his truck at the marina, going through the printed emails. "Jesus, Jim," Tony said, shaking his head. "This is cold-blooded. Can they actually do this? Take the marina? Depends on how the property is titled and what kind of prenup you have. We don't have a prenup, and the marina is in both our names because of the business loan we took out 5 years ago." Tony was quiet for a long time. "Jim, if Margaret files for divorce and claims you're emotionally unstable, she might be able to get a temporary restraining order. That could freeze your access to business accounts, maybe even force you out of the marina while the divorce is pending." "How long could that take?" "Years if they want to drag it out. And legal fees could force you to sell just to pay the lawyers." I felt trapped. Margaret and Chen had been planning this for months while I'd been completely oblivious. They had lawyers, strategies, documentation of my supposed instability. All I had was a folder full of emails that proved my wife was cheating on me. "There has to be something we can do," I said. Tony was quiet for a moment. "There might be, but you're not going to like it." "Tell me." "We set a trap. Make them think their plan is working, but document everything they do. Get them to incriminate themselves in a way that can't be explained away in court." "How?" "We make Margaret think you're having a breakdown. Act erratic. Give her ammunition for her emotional instability claim. But we make sure everything is recorded, witnessed, documented. When she tries to use it against you, we show that it was all an act and that she was manipulating the situation." It was risky. If something went wrong, I could end up looking actually unstable. "There's another option," Tony said. "We could approach Chen directly. Let him know we're on to him, see if he backs off." I thought about Chen's pattern of targeting married women, about the cold calculation in those emails, about the way he'd kissed my wife in the hotel parking lot. "No," I said. "He's not going to back off. And if we tip him off, they'll just be more careful." "So we set the trap?" I looked out at the marina, at the boats my father and I had worked on together, at the business that represented 3 generations of my family's sweat and dreams. We set the trap. The trap took 2 weeks to set up properly. Tony helped me install hidden cameras in my house and workshop, positioned to capture conversations without being obvious. We also set up a recording app on my phone that could be activated with a simple touch. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would give Margaret exactly what she wanted, evidence of my emotional instability, but everything would be carefully staged and recorded. When she tried to use it against me in divorce court, we'd reveal that she had been manipulating and provoking me, which would destroy her credibility and expose her true motives. Margaret made it easy by continuing her pattern of lies and public humiliation. She forgot to invite me to her company's holiday party, then acted surprised when I showed up anyway. She criticized everything from my clothes to my table manners in front of her coworkers, including David Chen, who watched the whole performance with barely concealed amusement. That night, I put on my first performance. "I can't take this anymore, Margaret," I said, raising my voice just enough to sound genuinely upset. "You're trying to make me look like an idiot in front of everyone." "Don't be paranoid, Jim. You're imagining things." "I'm not imagining anything. You've been different for months, distant, critical. It's like you can't stand to be around me." Margaret's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of outburst she needed for her documentation. "You're scaring me when you yell like this," she said, pulling out her phone. "Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist or something." "I don't need a therapist. I need my wife to stop treating me like I'm some kind of embarrassment." I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Through the hidden camera, I watched Margaret immediately call someone, probably Chen, and excitedly describe my breakdown. Over the next week, I gave her several more performances. I accidentally broke a dish while arguing about her late nights at work. I raised my voice when she criticized my appearance before a neighborhood barbecue. I even threw some tools around in my workshop after she made a snide comment about my hobby business. Each time, Margaret documented everything. Photos of the broken dish, audio recordings of me yelling, detailed notes about my increasingly erratic behavior. She was building her case, just like the emails had outlined. But she was also being recorded by cameras she didn't know existed, showing her deliberate provocation and manipulation. The final piece of the trap came when Margaret announced she wanted to have a serious talk about our marriage. We sat in the living room on a Sunday evening, with Margaret positioned carefully so the hidden camera could capture both our faces. "Jim, I'm worried about you," she began. "Your behavior lately has been very concerning. The anger, the mood swings, the paranoid accusations." "What paranoid accusations? You keep implying that I'm lying to you about where I go and who I'm with. That's not healthy, Jim. That's not the foundation of a good marriage." I almost laughed. Margaret was gaslighting me while being recorded by 3 different cameras. "You're right," I said, letting my shoulders slump in defeat. "I've been feeling really lost lately, like I don't know who I am anymore." Margaret leaned forward, sensing victory. "I think we need some time apart, just to figure things out. Maybe you could stay at your brother's place for a while, get some perspective." "You want me to move out?" "Just temporarily, until you can get some help and work through these issues." This was it, the moment Margaret had been working toward for months. Getting me out of the house, establishing a pattern of instability, setting up the legal framework for her divorce strategy. "If that's what you think is best," I said quietly. Margaret actually smiled. "I think it could be really good for both of us." That night, I packed a bag and drove to Tony's house, where we reviewed the recordings from the past 2 weeks. "This is incredible," Tony said, watching Margaret's performance on the laptop screen. "She's manipulating every situation, provoking you into reactions, then documenting the results. Any divorce lawyer worth his fee will see right through this." "What about the marina?" "With these recordings and the emails showing their real plan, no court would award her half the business, especially not when we can prove she was working with Chen to defraud you." I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders for the first time in months. Margaret thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but the truth was, I'd been playing a completely different game. "So, what's next?" I asked. Tony smiled. "Now we spring the trap." The next morning, I called Margaret and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss our separation. She suggested the cafe downtown, a public place where she'd feel safe and in control. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, where Tony could watch from his truck across the street. Margaret arrived 15 minutes later, looking confident and composed. "How are you feeling, Jim?" she asked, settling into her chair with the careful concern of someone who was documenting every interaction. "Better, actually. Being away from the house has given me some clarity." "That's wonderful. I'm so glad you're getting the help you need." I hadn't mentioned getting help, but Margaret was already rewriting the narrative in her head. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She tensed slightly. "Of course. Are you having an affair?" Margaret's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, righteous indignation. "Jim, this is exactly what I'm talking about. These paranoid accusations, this inability to trust. This is why we need time apart." "So you're not having an affair?" I'm not going to dignify that question with an answer. The fact that you would even ask shows how much work you need to do on yourself. I nodded slowly, as if accepting her non-answer. "You're right. I'm sorry for asking." Margaret relaxed. "I forgive you. I know you're struggling." "There's something else I need to tell you," I said. "I've been thinking about the marina, about our future, and I've decided I want to sell it." Margaret tried to hide her excitement, but I could see it in her eyes. "Are you sure? It's been in your family for so long?" "I think it's time for a fresh start. For both of us. I've already talked to a real estate agent about getting it appraised." This was a complete lie, but Margaret didn't know that. "That sounds like a very mature decision, Jim. I was thinking we could use the money to travel, maybe buy a place somewhere warm, start over completely." Margaret's smile was so fake it was almost painful to watch. "That sounds wonderful. Very healing." We finished our coffee with Margaret playing the role of the supportive wife, helping her unstable husband through a difficult time. She even hugged me goodbye, a performance for anyone who might be watching. But I knew Margaret would be calling David Chen before she even got to her car. The marina sale was exactly what they'd been planning, and now it seemed like it was my idea. That evening, Tony and I sat in his truck outside David Chen's apartment building, waiting. "You sure about this?" Tony asked. "I'm sure." At 8:30, Margaret's BMW pulled into the parking garage. At 8:45, my phone rang. "Hi, honey," Margaret said, her voice bright with false cheer. "I just wanted to let you know I'm having dinner with Linda tonight. Girl talk, you know how it is." "Have fun," I said. "I love you." "Love you too." I hung up and looked at Tony. "She's here. You ready for this?" I thought about the photo studio, about months of lies and manipulation, about the emails planning to steal my family's business. "I'm ready." We got out of the truck and walked into David Chen's building. The doorman was reading a newspaper and barely looked up when Tony flashed his old police badge. "Police business," Tony said. "We need to speak with David Chen in apartment 4B. The doorman waved us toward the elevators without question. We rode up to the 4th floor in silence. At apartment 4B, I could hear music and laughter through the door. Margaret's laugh, bright and happy in a way I hadn't heard in months. Tony looked at me one last time. "You sure about this?" I knocked on the door. The music stopped. Footsteps approached the door and I heard David Chen's voice. "Who is it?" "Building management," Tony said. "We have a noise complaint." The door opened, and David Chen stood there in an expensive silk robe, looking annoyed. Behind him, I could see Margaret on the couch, wearing a negligee I'd never seen before. Chen's face went white when he saw me. "Hello, David," I said. "We need to talk." David Chen tried to close the door, but Tony was already pushing past him into the apartment. I followed, taking in the scene that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Margaret scrambled to cover herself with a throw pillow, her face cycling through shock, fear, and finally, anger. "Jim, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" The same way I found your emails, I said calmly. The same way I found your plans to steal my marina and destroy my life. Chen had recovered from his initial shock and was trying to take control of the situation. I think you should leave. Margaret and I are both adults, and what we do is none of your business. Actually, David, since Margaret is still my wife, it's very much my business, especially when you're planning to defraud me. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved screenshots of their emails. Once you get rid of Jim, we can sell the marina property, I read aloud. My contact at the real estate firm says waterfront property like that is worth at least $2 million. Margaret's face went pale. How did you get those emails? The same way I got these, I said, pulling out my other phone and playing the recording of our coffee conversation from that morning. Margaret's voice filled the room. That sounds like a very mature decision, Jim. That sounds wonderful. Very healing. You've been recording me? Margaret's voice was shrill with outrage. I've been documenting your manipulation and fraud, I corrected. Just like you've been documenting my supposed mental instability. I turned to Chen, who was standing by the window looking like he wanted to jump. Tell me, David, how many other married women have you done this to? Tony did some research on your employment history. Very interesting pattern. Chen's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Target unhappy wives, promise them a better life, help them divorce their husbands and split the assets, then move on to the next victim. It's a good scam. How much were you planning to take Margaret for? Margaret looked at Chen with sudden uncertainty. What is he talking about? He's trying to manipulate you, just like he's been manipulating this whole situation, Chen said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tony stepped forward. David Chen, age 36, previously employed at Hartwell Industries, Coastal Solutions, and Meridian Tech, left each job under mysterious circumstances after becoming involved with married female co-workers. In each case, the woman ended up divorced and financially ruined within 2 years. Margaret was staring at Chen like she was seeing him for the first time. Is that true? Margaret, don't listen to them. They're just trying to break us up. But I could see doubt creeping into Margaret's eyes. For all her faults, she wasn't stupid. Here's what's going to happen, I said, settling into Chen's expensive leather chair. Margaret, you're going to gather your things and come home with me. We're going to sit down like adults and discuss the terms of our divorce. I'm not going anywhere with you, Margaret said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'm going to the police tomorrow morning with evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. I'm going to your boss at TechFlow with documentation of your affair with a subordinate. And I'm going to every gossip in town with recordings of you planning to steal my family's business. Margaret's face crumpled. She knew I had her. And David, I continued, you're going to disappear. Tonight. I don't care where you go, but if I see you anywhere near my wife, my business, or my town again, Tony here is going to have some very interesting conversations with your previous victims. I bet they'd love to compare notes. Chen looked like he wanted to argue, but Tony's presence and police background made him think twice. This isn't over, Chen said weakly. Yes, it is, I replied. Margaret, get dressed. We're leaving. 20 minutes later, Margaret and I sat in my truck in the parking garage, the silence heavy between us. How long have you known? She asked finally. Months. The receipt from Rossetti's was the first clue, but I've been watching you lie to my face for weeks. Margaret started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and defeat. I never meant for it to go this far, she said. Yes, you did. You planned every detail, the public humiliation, the documentation of my supposed instability, the plan to steal the marina. You've been working on this for months. I just wanted something better. Is that so wrong? I looked at my wife of 15 years, this woman I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, and felt nothing but pity. No, Margaret. Wanting something better isn't wrong, but destroying someone else's life to get it is. We drove home in silence. At the house, I helped Margaret carry her things inside. Then we sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals and made plans for our future. What happens now? Margaret asked. Now we get divorced. Quietly, without destroying each other. You can keep the house and half our savings. I keep the marina and my dignity. And if I don't agree? Then I release everything to the police, your boss, and the local newspaper. Your choice. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she nodded. I'll call a lawyer tomorrow. Good. And Margaret? She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. If you ever try to contact David Chen again, or if you ever attempt to interfere with my business, I will destroy you. Completely and publicly. Do you understand? She nodded again, too defeated to argue. I stood up and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Margaret asked. To Tony's. I'll be back tomorrow to get my things. Jim? I turned back. I'm sorry. I really am. I looked at her for a moment, this woman who had shared my life and my dreams and had been willing to destroy both for a chance at something she thought was better. No, you're not, I said. You're just sorry you got caught. I walked out of the house and drove to Tony's, where we sat on his porch drinking beer and watching the sun set over the marina. So what now? Tony asked. Now I rebuild. The business, my life, my reputation, everything Margaret tried to destroy. Think she'll stick to the deal? I thought about Margaret's face when she realized David Chen had been playing her just like she'd been playing me. She'll stick to it. She doesn't have a choice. 3 months later, the divorce was final. Margaret moved to Boston, where she got a job at another tech company. She never contacted me again. David Chen disappeared completely. Tony's contacts in other states reported that he'd left Massachusetts the night of our confrontation and hadn't been seen since. Katie chose to stay with me, disgusted by her mother's betrayal and manipulation. She started working at the marina part-time while finishing her senior year of high school. The business thrived. Word got around town about what Margaret had tried to do, and the community rallied around me. Customers who hadn't used the marina in years brought their boats back. New clients appeared regularly. And 6 months after the divorce was final, I ran into Pete Kowalski, the photographer, at the grocery store. Jim, he called out. I've been meaning to ask you, would you like to schedule a new family portrait? Just you and Katie this time. I thought about the last family photo session, about Margaret's cruel words and public humiliation, about how that moment had started the chain of events that led to the discovery of her betrayal. You know what, Pete? I think we'd like that very much. 2 weeks later, Katie and I sat in Pete's studio, smiling genuinely for the camera. The photo turned out perfectly. 2 people who had survived betrayal and manipulation and come out stronger on the other side. I had it enlarged and framed, and it now hangs in the marina office where everyone can see it. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the best outcomes. Margaret had tried to write me out of the picture, but in the end, she was the one who disappeared, and I was still here, still standing, still smiling for the camera.